Wombleton is a village in the Rydale district of North Yorkshire, located just south from the A170 Thirsk to Scarborough Road, 3 miles east of Helmsley and 7 miles to the west of Pickering. In the 1930s, Welburn Hall had a small private airfield located on a flat area of land immediately to the east of Wombleton Grange. This area was surveyed in 1942 to assess its suitability, and despite its close proximity to the North Yorkshire moors and some reservations about its elevation, it was selected for development as an airfield for Bomber Command. Between 1942 and 1943, construction of the airfield took place, which entailed the closure of a small B road that crossed the site. It was to the typical Bomber Command standard of 3 concrete runways, with the main 104 at 2,000 yards, with subsidiaries 046 and 167 at 1,400 yards. The connecting perimeter track was dotted with 36 spectacle hard standings in 2 main groups to the north and the south. The airfield's number 1 site and the number 2 administrative site were on the west of the airfield near Wombleton Grange. A watch office for all commands type 1277941 with medium front windows to plan 34343 was built, as were the standard 3 hangars of 2 type T2s and 1 type B1, although looking at the plan it seems that a further hangar was added sometime later. The sewage works and bomb stores were in the southwest corner of the airfield in Harrow Fox Covert, close to Ricklemore Lane. Towards the A170 road were the dispersed sites, with WAF site number 12 and sick quarters site number 13 being located to the south of Syke Wood. The airfield had a given population of 285 RAF officers and 1,376 other ranks, with a further 11 WAF officers and 193 WAFs. RAF Wombleton opened on the 1st of October 1943 within No. 6 Royal Canadian Air Force Group, joining Dalton and Dishforth as substations of No. 61 Training Base at Topcliffe. During late 1943 and early 1944, the training of bomber crews had become a priority because of the heavy losses in RAF Bomber Command. Using aircraft withdrawn from operations and being flown by inexperienced crews, accidents and fatalities were a normal everyday occurrence at training stations. It is estimated that over 8,000 deaths occurred during training. No. 1666 Heavy Conversion Unit arrived from Dalton on the 21st of October, equipped with 16 Halifaxes. The first course at Wombleton commenced on the 5th of November, and soon after, the usual accidents on a training base started. On the 10th of December, Halifax DT-584 made a heavy landing at 23:15 hours and swung off the runway into mud, sustaining slight damage when the tail wheel unit broke off. Also that day, Halifax DT-689 was having its engines run up on a dispersal when the port outer engine caught fire at 22:40 hours. The aircraft fire was put out, with the aircraft suffering minor damage. Number 1679 HCU arrived from Eastmoor on the 13th of December with 12 Lancaster Mark IIs to work alongside number 1666. On Christmas Eve, Lancaster DS-624 of 1679 was awaiting takeoff with the engines idling when the starboard inner engine caught fire from fuel dropping onto it. The extinguishers failed to put the flames out. While the crew escaped the aircraft, it ran off the runway and onto the grass, and the fire spread to the cockpit. The station's fire teams managed to put out the fire before it spread any further. 1944 arrived, and the concrete runways and tracks at Wombleton were already breaking up with the constant heavy aircraft use, and so the decision was made to move 1666 and 1679 to RAF Eastmoor on the 21st of January, while the damage at Wombleton was repaired. Number 1679 was subsumed into number 1666 on the 27th to bring that unit up to full strength. And on the 30th, 1666 returned to Wombleton and training resumed, as did the accidents. During February, at around 1900 hours, a Halifax failed to gain height and had the rear wheel catch the electric wire near the council houses, causing a blackout. The crew, unaware of this, kept flying with the wire trailing behind the aircraft, and after making a circuit of the airfield, landed safely. On the 9th of March, Halifax JB 859 is listed as having sustained minor unspecific damage. The following night at 2100 hours, Halifax W7668 was being taxied when it swung and struck a concrete culvert with the tail wheel being sheared off and the aircraft suffering slight damage. On the night of the 6th to 7th of April, Lancaster DS-607, after taking off at 1935 hours on a night training exercise, suffered hydraulic failure, and just after 0100 hours attempted to land at Topcliffe. Unable to manually lower the flaps, the pilot opted to fly a circuit and try again. On approach, after crossing the edge of the airfield, the port wheel struck an unused gun emplacement, which tore off the port wheel and undercarriage leg. The pilot managed to raise the Lancaster to make another circuit before making an emergency landing, badly damaged. The unit book records that at 0120 hours, DS-607 came to brief at Topcliffe and was donated to the scrap heap. On the 27th of April, Halifax JB859 was the fourth of 6 aircraft that had been taxied around the perimeter track in preparation for takeoff for a bullseye training flight. The pilot, Flying Officer Willard K. Wells of the Royal Canadian Air Force, stopped the aircraft well back from the aircraft in front to await their turn to begin the takeoff with the engines running. The brakes of the aircraft appeared not to have been fully applied, and at 23:17 hours it slowly ran into the back of Halifax JD-106, which was just ahead of it. The rear of JD-106 was badly damaged, and the rear gunner, Sergeant Ward Thomas Phelan of the Royal Canadian Air Force, was killed in the collision. Flying Officer Wells was later court-martialed on account of negligence, but was exonerated. On the 30th of April, Halifax DT-737 was taking off at 17:25 hours for Sergeant Samuel Houston's initial flight in a Halifax with instructor Squadron Leader Harry Gowan when the aircraft suffered a burst tyre. Getting the aircraft airborne, a 10-minute flight allowed the airfield to prepare for an emergency landing. At 17:35 hours, Squadron Leader Gowan landed the Halifax, managing to stay off the damaged wheel for much of the landing. However, When the aircraft slowed, the wheel made contact and the Halifax ran off the runway and dug into the soft ground, damaging the wheel hub and making 2 violent ground loops when the aircraft's tail broke off. Although the 2 pilots were unhurt, the aircraft was deemed too badly damaged to be repaired. By May, the establishment of number 1666 HCU stood at 36 Halifax Mark IIs. On the 17th of May, Halifax DT 551 experienced a crosswind on final approach, and the starboard wing dropped. The pilot, Flying Officer Heron, on his first training flight since arrival at Wombleton, tried to correct, but when the port wheel touched the ground, the leg collapsed, resulting in a ground loop. A small fire broke out, but this was quickly extinguished, and the crew of 8 were not injured. A subsequent investigation discovered that it was a previously unnoticed crack in the port undercarriage which had caused the failure of the leg. At 10:29 hours on the 27th, Halifax HR 834 was taking off when the starboard outer engine failed. The aircraft swung to starboard immediately after leaving the ground, sliced the tops off 4 trees in the wood at the south end of the runway, and then crashed into the field behind the wood. 5 of the crew sustained injuries and a fire broke out. This was quickly put out by the Airfield's fire crew, although the Halifax was badly damaged. The failed engine was stripped down and a broken valve spring was found to be at fault, even though the engine had just 14 hours running time. On the 21st of June, to conform with standard RCAF practice, 1666 HCU received the name of Mohawk Squadron. The next day, Flying Officer Arthur Harker, in Halifax JD 106, the same aircraft which had been hit from behind by Halifax JB 859 on the 27th of April, took off at 21:25 hours on a night cross-country training flight and practice bombing exercise. At around 01:05 hours on the return leg, and while flying in cloud, the aircraft flew into high ground at Rudland Rig between Farndale and Bransdale. The Halifax broke up and partly caught fire. The rear section of the aircraft broke off, which saved the rear gunner from injury. The rest of the aircraft disintegrated over a distance of some 450 yards. The other 6 crew were killed in the crash. On the 28th of June, Halifax BB 217 landed at Wombleton at 15:07 hours, following a bullseye training flight, but because of a faulty braking system on the starboard main wheel, on taxiing around the perimeter track, the aircraft swerved to starboard. It then continued on through the wooden night flying control, which was fortunately empty at the time, completely demolishing it. The Halifax sustained minor fuselage damage. On the 10th of July, Halifax HX 147 took off from Wombleton at 22:10 hours on a training flight. At 03:25 hours the aircraft crashed very close to the road between the Bumper Castle pub and Rowntree's chocolate factory near New Earswick in York. All on board were killed. The reason for the crash is not known. Returning from a night cross-country training flight on the 17th of July, Halifax JD 212 swung on landing at 03:55 hours and crashed. The pilot, Flying Officer Bruce Carling Wallace, complained he found it hard to fly straight and level in the air. When the aircraft was checked, it was found to have a buckled wing. Because of the combined damage from the crash and the buckled wing, the aircraft was consigned to the scrap heap. At 21:45 hours on the 23rd of July, Halifax JD 372 set out on a training flight consisting of a bullseye exercise and a fighter affiliation exercise. At 03:30 hours, the fighter affiliation part of the exercise began with a hurricane from RAF Dalton. At around 7,000 feet, the fighter pilot reported that the starboard outer wing of the Halifax was on fire. The fire spread rapidly, and the Halifax spun out of control into the ground at 03:55 hours, close to what is known as the Sheep Walk near Slingsby. All the crew died in the crash. On the 18th of October, at 16:17 hours, Halifax JB 917 had just landed at Wombleton, following a series of daytime circuits and landings. The pilot selected the wrong lever and raised the undercarriage instead of the flaps, and one of the undercarriage legs folded, damaging the two engines that struck the ground. A safety solenoid, which should have prevented this raising of the undercarriage, was found to be at fault. In the early hours of the 20th of October, Halifax LW 235 was returning to Wombleton following a night bombing exercise in poor weather. The pilot, having trouble seeing the runway lighting, made 2 attempts at landing but had overshot each time. On the third attempt, at 02:55 hours, the Halifax clipped the roof of the farm building and then crashed at Nunnington, with the aircraft breaking up and catching fire. 5 of the crew sustained injuries, while 2 others were killed. On the 9th of November 1944, No. 61 Base Topcliffe became renumbered as No. 76 Base in the newly formed No. 7 Bomber Heavy Conversion Unit Group, still with Dishforth, Dalton and Wombleton as substations. On the 20th of the month, 1666 HCU is recorded as having an establishment of 32 Halifax 3s, 2 Spitfires and 2 Hurricanes. But soon it was to receive Lancasters, for these had started to replace the Halifaxes in RCAF squadrons. On the night of the 18th to 19th of January 1945, a gale over Yorkshire was responsible for damaging some of the airfield buildings and a number of aircraft. Lancasters HK 745, LM 391, LM 460, HK 736, HK 742 and PB 578 sustained damage at Wombleton, mainly to the tail units. An instructional aircraft, Lancaster DS 730, that had all the engines removed, was not adequately tied down and was blown off its dispersal, hitting Lancaster HK 742 on the next dispersal. On the 11th of February, Lancaster PD 434 was having its engines run up when the brakes failed to hold it. The aircraft jumped the wheel blocks and ran 30 feet into an engine stand, sustaining minor damage. The brakes were found to be defective. On the night of the 23rd to 24th of March, 1666 supplied 5 Lancasters and crews to undertake a sweepstake diversionary flight across France, while the main Bomber Command Force of No. 5 Group's Lancasters and No. 8 Group Mosquitoes flew a bombing raid on Wesel in Germany. The Wombleton Lancasters returned to base at 01:43 hours. Lancaster ND 656 was taxied to a dispersal, and 2 minutes after landing, while the crew were making their closing down checks, the flight engineer's harness straps caught on the aircraft's undercarriage lever, and the wheels folded up, damaging the aircraft when it dropped onto the ground. ND 656 was later written off. At 09:30 hours, on the 6th of April, Lancaster NG 393 was being given a daily inspection on a dispersal when a short circuit in the main electrical wiring caused a fire in the port outer engine. The fire was put out, but only after it had caused minor damage to the engine and wiring loom. At 02:50 hours on the 23rd of April, Lancaster LM 391 was taking off from Wombleton Airfield when 3 flash bombs in the bomb bay exploded. Slight damage was caused to the underside of the fuselage, but fortunately the aircraft did not catch fire and made a safe landing back at Wombleton. 1666 continued to train aircrew until June, but after VE Day the unit began to wind down. On the 3rd of August, No. 1666 HCU was disbanded, and Wombleton was returned to the RAF. On the 1st of September, No. 76 Base Topcliffe was disbanded. Wombleton was turned over to Maintenance Command, and from the 20th of November became home to No. 261 Maintenance Unit for equipment disposal storage. From June 1946, the RAF Regiment Battle School also became resident at Wombleton. Number 261 MU was to stay at Wombleton until the 10th of September 1946, when they were replaced with number 268 Maintenance Unit. The RAF Regiment Battle School closed in January 1947, leaving 268 MU alone at the airfield until the 31st of August 1948, when they too departed. After this date, the airfield lay disused until finally disposed of in 1949. The post-war reopening of the B Road carved a slice through the east side of the airfield where some of the Perry track has been removed. During the 1950s, some of the accommodation blocks were used to house homeless people, and at some time in the same decade the airfield began to see use by light aircraft and microlights. Part of the west side of the airfield is now occupied by a caravan and camping park, although it still sees some occasional flying. It has mainly been returned to agriculture. A few of the buildings, including the control tower and one hangar, are still standing, together with many of the dispersals. Wombleton is still open for flying as a private airfield, operated by Wind Sports Centre Limited. At the turning of the Harome Road is the Second World War Royal Canadian Air Force Memorial. This was dedicated on the 28th of May 2001 and comprises a rough stone obelisk, a fairly standard type of memorial for Canadian bases, with a plaque and inscription.